You are already inside the early stages of a currency collapse, but most people won't recognize it until the damage is permanent. The warning signs have been visible for years, and every major empire that fell into monetary chaos left the same trail behind. You're not watching a pattern from the outside, you are living inside it, and the shift has already begun. The strange part is that the early stages never look like a collapse. They look like politics. They look like stimulus. They look like rising markets, rising wages, rising asset prices, and rising national confidence. They look like progress. By the time the population realizes what those signals actually meant, the currency has already crossed the line that no government ever walks back from. Every major currency failure in the last 100 years followed one long chain reaction that always started quietly. Germany in 1923, Brazil in the early 1990s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s. Different cultures, different politics, different leaders, different national strengths. Yet the same pattern unfolded so precisely that historians can point to the start of the chain long before the citizens ever felt the consequences. Today, the United States is replaying those early signals with an uncomfortable level of accuracy. And the most dangerous part is that the average American believes their economy is fundamentally different, stronger, or immune. Every nation in history believed the same thing when they entered the second stage. None of them were right. The collapse never begins with the currency losing value. It begins with the government losing discipline. Germany set the blueprint for this long before hyperinflation became the single image everyone remembers. After World War I, the German government had more obligations than revenue, more political pressure than stability, and more fear of public backlash than willingness to cut spending. They chose the same solution every government chooses when faced with a fiscal crisis. They can explain honestly, they resorted to printing. Not all at once, not visibly, not in a way the population could understand. It began with the central bank expanding the money supply to cover government deficits, one decision at a time, each one rationalized as necessary and temporary. Once they started, they couldn't stop, because stopping meant facing the deficit itself. And no government in crisis willingly confronts the truth. Brazil followed the same starting point decades later, a government trapped by political promises, rising debt, and a shrinking ability to fund itself without manufacturing more currency. Before Brazil's inflation became a global case study, the early signals were familiar. Spending that outpaced revenue, leaders who downplayed the risks, and a central bank forced into the role of silent financier. They didn't call it money printing. They used technical language to make it sound more controlled. Monetary expansion, stabilization measures, liquidity support. The United States today uses similar language. The words change, but the mechanism is the same. Zimbabwe's path was the most extreme, but even it did not start with visible collapse. It started with a government trying to manage economic pressure without reducing spending or tightening policy. At first, the public didn't see the money creation happening. They only saw government assurances that everything was under control. They believed it. Every population believes the first stage because it always begins with explanations that sound reasonable. Inflation isn't a threat. The deficit isn't dangerous. The debt is manageable. The system is resilient. These lines appeared in all three countries before the real decline began. You can hear versions of the same lines in the United States today, and not from fringe voices, from official ones. The next phase is the turning point that determines the future of the currency. It's when the government becomes structurally dependent on money creation to keep the economy functioning, not temporarily dependent, structurally dependent. Germany crossed this line years before hyperinflation, when tax revenue was no longer enough to service obligations. They already knew that raising taxes would trigger political instability, and cutting spending would trigger public unrest. Printing became the only politically survivable choice. Once they crossed that threshold, it was irreversible. Brazil's transition into the same stage was slower but identical in shape. The government discovered that any attempt to reduce inflation through tightening would trigger recession and political backlash, so they abandoned the idea. If they tightened, they risked collapse. If they printed, they bought time. Every government chooses time. Brazil chose time until they ran out of it. Zimbabwe crossed the line when government spending outpaced economic output and foreign capital fled the country. With no external lenders willing to support them, the central bank became the only source of financing left. That moment marked the beginning of the spiral. When the United States began running multi-trillion-dollar deficits as a baseline, not as emergency spending, it signaled the same structural shift. The debt was no longer a temporary wartime phenomenon. It became embedded. The government now needs rising debt to maintain stability. It cannot reduce spending without triggering political crisis, and it cannot raise taxes enough to cover the gap without triggering economic slowdown. The central bank becomes the only fallback, exactly as it did in every historical collapse. This is not a prediction, it is a mathematical reality, and it marks the entry into the early collapse pattern that no nation has escaped once entered. The public never sees this stage as a warning. They see high asset prices, they see rising wages, They see strong markets, they see stimulus, they see government assurances that inflation will normalize. That's the most deceptive part of the pattern. The system looks strong on the surface because the artificial expansion of money makes everything appear inflated, including economic confidence. Germany saw a boom before the collapse. Brazil saw asset surges. Zimbabwe saw markets temporarily stabilize before they imploded. The United States experienced one of the largest asset booms in history after massive monetary expansion. People interpreted it as resilience. Every historical case saw the same misinterpretation. The next stage is when inflation becomes persistent, not because of temporary shocks, but because the underlying structure of the economy has been altered. Germany reached this point when the mark began losing purchasing power faster than wages could keep up, but the public still believed it was temporary. They blamed external factors. They blamed policy mistakes. They blamed everything except the underlying mechanism. Brazil did the same. Inflation in the early 1990s was blamed on corruption, mismanagement, and global conditions. Zimbabwe blamed sanctions, droughts, and foreign interference. The United States blames supply chain disruptions, geopolitical conflict, and corporate pricing. Every explanation avoids the real cause, excessive money creation relative to output. Once inflation becomes embedded in expectations, it's nearly impossible to reverse without severe economic contraction. Germany avoided contraction and chose the path that protected short-term stability while destroying long-term monetary credibility. Brazil tried multiple stabilization plans, each one failing because none addressed the structural dependence on printing. Zimbabwe implemented price controls, wage controls, and forced conversions, all of which accelerated the collapse. When a government reaches the point where it must choose between short-term pain and long-term destruction, it always chooses delay. Delay is the fuel of collapse. The United States is now facing inflation that is no longer a one-time event. It has become part of the system. Even when it cools temporarily, the pressure returns because the underlying fiscal structure hasn't changed. The national debt continues to grow faster than GDP. Interest payments consume a rising share of revenue. Political polarization makes spending cuts impossible. The only path forward becomes the same one chosen by every collapsing currency: more creation of money through direct or indirect means. Eventually, the population begins to lose trust, not because of ideology, but because daily life becomes harder to afford. Germany experienced this when groceries doubled within weeks. Brazil saw it when wages could no longer buy basic goods before the next payday. Zimbabwe saw it when stores began marking prices several times per day. The early warnings in the United States are milder, but unmistakable. Rising consumer debt, shrinking savings, increased credit dependence, and a widening gap between wages and cost of living. These signals were present in every historical collapse long before the official crisis began. The crucial moment arrives when the government attempts to control the damage without addressing the cause. Germany imposed price controls, leading to shortages. Brazil instituted currency reforms that reset prices temporarily, but did not resolve fiscal imbalance. Zimbabwe enforced strict regulations that worsened scarcity. In every case, these interventions accelerated the loss of confidence because they revealed that the government was out of options. The United States has not reached the point of extreme intervention, but it has reached the stage where policy responses no longer solve problems. They shift them. Interest rate hikes slow inflation but threaten financial stability. Stimulus boosts the economy but raises deficits. Attempts to manage inflation without addressing spending create cycles that resemble the early collapse stages observed in Germany, Brazil, and Zimbabwe. The pattern is not identical, but the mechanism is. Once trust begins to erode, the collapse becomes psychological as much as economic. In Germany, people rushed to spend money before it lost value. In Brazil, the population lost faith in long-term savings. In Zimbabwe, confidence in the currency evaporated entirely. The United States is witnessing early behavioral shifts, rising interest in alternative assets, declining confidence in government fiscal management, and increasing polarization over economic narratives. These are not the final stages, but they are the warnings that the pattern is active. The final stage of collapse is rapid, chaotic, and unmistakable, but it is never the real story. The real story is the slow erosion that happened long before. Germany's hyperinflation was only the visible ending. Brazil's currency reform was only the forced reset. Zimbabwe's trillion-dollar notes were only the final symptom. The collapse began years earlier, quietly, when governments chose the path of monetary expansion over structural discipline. The United States has not entered the final stage. It is entering the second one, the stage where the government becomes dependent on money creation, the stage where inflation becomes structural, the stage where public trust begins to shift, the stage where the pattern becomes recognizable to anyone who has studied history honestly. No nation has avoided the outcome once they crossed into this phase without severe correction, and severe correction is politically impossible. You're not watching this from a distance. You're inside it. The pattern is unfolding in real time. Every historical signal is in motion. Nothing about this is theoretical. The collapse is not here, but the path toward it has been chosen. What happens next will not depend on belief, opinion, or ideology. It will depend on mathematics, pressure, and consequences that no government has ever escaped once they began. You have seen the pattern in its full shape. You know where it leads. The truth is simple. Once a currency enters this stage, the future becomes a countdown. What you do with that truth is on you.